So starting off part 2, we have Sergeant Chavez arriving at the scene within 3 minutes of the UFO's departure. He speaks with Lonnie, and then they both go down into the arroyo where the UFO landed. Sergeant Chavez then notices these landing gear impressions on the ground. Let's hear what the state police officer has to say.
What the hell is this?
We found some indentation on the ground where this thing had landed, and the marks into the ground were 9 inches deep, 8 inches long, and 9 inches wide.
There were 4 landing gear marks in the ground that ended up making a very interesting pattern. We will go over this landing gear pattern in more detail later, but it was at this point that Sergeant Chavez realized that Lonnie Zamora was not pulling a trick, or other people were not pulling a trick on Lonnie. Sergeant Chavez then called the FBI to come in and help investigate. Now we have Mr. Arthur Burns of the FBI involved in the investigation. But please do not refer to the FBI as participating in any fashion. So as far as we're concerned, the FBI was never here. Mr. Burns then called Army Captain Richard T. Holder. They met at the state police office and interviewed Lonnie, and this interview was what we went over in part 1. After the interview, they all went to the UFO landing site. Captain Holder lived in Socorro and worked at the White Sands Missile Range. He was notified within 2 hours of the UFO event and had the reports done just after midnight. Let's listen to Captain Holder.
Well, my first impression was that it was something from the range that needed possible help, first aid, attention, or at best security. The more I got into it, the less convinced I was that that was the case.
His report included this diagram that we looked at in part 1. This is Lonnie's rough sketch of the Tic-Tac-Shaped UFO when he was at about 100 feet away. And this is the first rough sketch that they did of the physical evidence at the landing site, like the landing gear, indentions, and the burn marks. Now, they redid the landing site diagram in the morning when they had daylight, and this one is much more precise. And then finally, we have the insignia that was on the UFO, and this was intentionally changed out by Captain Holder. He wanted Lonnie to keep the real insignia secret. That way it would help determine if future reports were real or fake. This is a drawing of the UFO that happened within 2 weeks of the sighting, and this is a better representation of what Lonnie saw that day. Rick Baca was the artist when he was in 8th grade. And in the local newspaper, Zamora commented, Baca's drawing most closely resembled the object. So now let's take a closer look at the physical evidence left behind by the landing gear. The initial diagram that they drew on the first night seems to focus more on the burn marks versus the landing gear marks. So we can see that this burn mark up here shows the apparent direction of the burn going toward the left, and then we have the center burn mark, and then these 2 burns as the UFO was leaving the area. So on the next day, they took more precise measurements of the landing gear marks, and now it doesn't look as random. But you still have this weird 2-foot offset between these 2 sides, and you've got about 1.5 feet offset between these 2 sides. But this intersecting area starts to look interesting because they're almost all perpendicular at 90-degree angles. These landing marks might have some kind of an engineering idea behind them, and this is what the article by W.T. Powers explores. So what would it take to get these angles to be all 90 degrees? At the end of the 19-foot diagonal, the allowable error is 2 inches. This discrepancy is within errors one might reasonably expect in choosing the points defining the quadrilateral. So just a 2-inch error on the measuring tape in the diagonals and you would get perfect 90s. He goes on to say, it is not reasonable, however, to suppose that a hoaxer would either be lucky enough or subtle enough to have placed the marks with such precision. That makes sense because there were some theories that Lonnie was hoaxed by a group of kids. Okay, big deal. It forms a right angle here in the middle. Well, here comes the engineering part. So remember how these sides were kind of weird lengths? You take these lengths and cut them in half and then draw a circle that intersects all of these midpoints. Then in the exact center of the circle, you have the main burn point for the propulsion system. This means that the center of gravity of the craft was directly over this burn number 1. If equal weight is supported by each one of these midpoints, then that would mean each pad is supporting equal weight. In other words, this random-looking placement of landing pads would result in equal distribution of the weight of whatever these pads were supporting. So there you have it. Reverse engineering the geometry of the physical evidence on the ground, that being the landing pad placement and the burn marks, it leads to this conclusion. This design is a balanced and efficient support for the weight of the UFO. I mean, wow. Who would have thought that by looking at this initial diagram? So the next very big deal to this case is Lonnie's description of the electrically induced modulated plasma flame. Now, I know that might sound complicated, but we are going to see a demonstration of this in the EPD laboratories. Now, remember this quote from part 1.
However, there is no indication that this vehicle, that it was beyond the state of the art of our present-day scientific knowledge.
So he is wrong about this, and many people get this wrong, and we are going to see exactly why. Captain Holder took soil samples from the landing site on the first day. These were sent in and evaluated with the conclusion that there is apparently no significant differences in elemental composition between the different samples. And not only were there soil samples, they also had burned pieces of cardboard and brush that showed no chemicals which would indicate a type of propellant. Now, this is a big problem because rockets and vertical takeoff and landing vehicles would require some kind of chemical to burn in order to get that flame. Listen to our current state-of-the-art vertical landing technology using chemical propellants.
2 candles coming down.
There they are.
Double sonic booms.
That is crazy. There would be chemical propellant traces all over the place. Imagine only being 100 feet away from something like this.
And the Falcons have landed.
So if the chemical rocket idea is out of the question, then what made this flame? All right, so So what's this all about? First, the music signal is just coming from a phone.
Plug that in, and that's going to the microphone in.
The microphone in is on a Collins AM radio transmitter. It's basically just oscillating electricity at a high frequency.
I'm going to play Bach Contrapunctus 10.
You sure it's playing?
This harpsichord. I'm going to start it right now.
Okay.
So the music is coming out of the flame.
That's just a basic spark that's created by high voltage electricity, but it seems to be making sounds. So on this attempt, the spark gap is actually dialed in better, so that spark or plasma flame will play the music.
So we're going to try Bach Violin Sonata No. 1 in G minor.
Things move on me? No, okay.
Oh, should be playing right now. What a trip. No matter how many times you see it, it's...
Uh-oh.
Okay, that's cool, and now you have an idea of what's going on, but let's amp it up a bit with some Tesla coils.
Which will be transmitting on the resonant frequency in the 7800 kilocycle range. You notice up here is that we have there's a little triangle piece of copper sheet going up to a peak from one of the rings on the end of the current coil, and we're going to get a freestanding little flame coming off of it.
So this is going to be a standing electrical flame that requires no chemicals to produce.
Okay, it should be going.
I turned the heater off. Let's try another piece of music. We're set. I'm happy. This is what I was after, and we got it.
Awesome job. So again, we have a flame that is created just by oscillating or alternating electric current. There are no fuels, chemicals, or propellants necessary for this type of flame. And the plasma flame itself can be modulated to produce sound, just like Lonnie reported the weird frequency pitch changes when the craft was taking off.
That's awesome.
So now you understand how the evidence supports that this is an electric flame and not a chemical combustion rocket type of flame that most people mistake it as. So we do not have technology that can do vertical takeoff and landings that are based on electricity. And then when all of the sound stops and the flame goes away, this thing still stays in the air and then heads off to the southwest at over 120 miles an hour. Yeah, this is technology that's way beyond us. Okay, now let's take a look at a second landing that occurred in a small northern New Mexico town called La Madera. This is where we have documented proof that the federal government is covering up UFO landings. The Air Force closed this incident out as a fire in a dump. So we have the comments here: much publicity following Socorro sighting. Witness had been drinking heavily. The area where the light was emitted was used as a dumping area, and a burn spot is at this location. Let's take a look. Because this incident was covered up, unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of data. This is the only picture that I've seen of this landing site. Let's learn what happened here, starting with this newspaper article. Lonnie's sighting happened on Friday at 6 p.m., and this one occurred only 30 hours later, so it was about 12:30 a.m. Sunday. So we start with a statement from the Santa Fe State Police Captain, Martin Vigil, that says there was definitely something there, which is a contradiction to just a fire in a dump. Orlando Gallegos got within 200 feet of a huge metal object that looked like an egg-shaped butane tank. An interesting description. He said flames spurted silently from numerous jets around the bottom of the object. It was as long as a telephone pole and about 14 feet in circumference. So we have an egg-shaped butane or propane tank, and the length of a telephone pole is anywhere from 30 to 60 feet long. Now, you've heard me call this shape a tic-tac.
What did it look like it was made out of?
Like a perfectly smooth white tic-tac. Or for people that need a bigger visualization, a giant propane tank.
Instead of a flying disc or flying saucer, this butane or propane tank description matches that of eyewitness Commander David Fravor in the 2004 Nimitz incident. In a different newspaper article, we see that the state police captain found that the ground was still smoldering 20 hours after the sighting. He said rocks in the center of the area were split, a bottle was melted, and green brush had been set on fire, evidently by the intense heat. And there was a report Saturday night by two unidentified motorists that said an object similar to the egg-shaped silver craft described by Zamora swooped down out of the sky toward their car in the Espanola area. So looking on the map, we have the White Sands Missile Range, Socorro, and about a 3-hour drive to La Madera, which is near Los Alamos. And then the Espanola area is only 35 minutes from the La Madera landing site. Now let's take a look at these Freedom of Information Act FBI files that you can download from TheBlackVault.com. These FBI files for the Zamora incident just happen to have a report for the La Madera landing. And here we are. An additional incident has been reported as happening at 1 a.m. at La Madera. Captain Vigil of the New Mexico State Police advises he interviewed the only known witness, who is Orlando Gallegos, age 35, and he was sober and frightened. He was visiting his father at La Madera and went out to tend some noisy horses at about 1 a.m. There was an object located about 300 feet from the house, something shaped like a butane tank, possibly 12 to 14 feet high and as long as a telephone pole. It was apparently on the ground and surrounded with a blue-white flame which appeared to come from portholes. He watched the scene for about 1 minute and then the flame went out. The object did not move and was silent at all times. He went back into the house, and then later during the daytime, he saw a state police officer and spoke of the incident to him. So now Captain Vigil is going to describe the physical evidence that was on site, which was covered up by the Air Force. Captain Vigil continued that he checked the site at 7:30 p.m. and noted a scorched circular area about 30 to 40 feet in diameter. And wouldn't it be nice to have had a diagram of what he says here, because we know the importance of the diagram of the landing site in Socorro. He noted one rectangular V-shaped indention in the ground, 8 by 12 inches, and about 3 to 4 inches deep. A fellow officer who was there earlier pointed to places of 3 more indentions, indicating the indentions were rectangular. I mean, just a simple diagram by the Air Force, and maybe even soil samples, just like they did 30 hours earlier. That's all we would have needed. And here are the alien footprints. Captain Vigil further stated he saw several smooth circular prints on the ground, about 3.5 inches in diameter. And in the FBI documents for the Zamora landing site in Socorro, they described those alien footprints like this. There were 3 circular marks in the earth which were smooth, approximately 4 inches in diameter, and penetrated in the sandy earth approximately 1/8 of an inch, as if a jar lid had gently been pushed into the sand. So over a day later, we now have the feds going on site, and this is probably Major Connors from Kirtland Air Force Base. He stated that at the scene there was still some smoldering material. He noted that there was miscellaneous rubbish in the area and that the site may have been a dump at one time. So far, we know that this is completely true because we can zoom in on the image and we see this was probably a dump site. And here is the cover-up. In his opinion, some material, such as a can of paint, could have caught fire and exploded. He also noted that probably Gallegos had an odor of alcohol about him. So that is how we get the fire in the dump conclusion in Project Blue Book for the La Madera UFO landing. Luckily, we have independent UFO researchers like Coral Lorenzen of A.P.R.O to help us fill in the blanks for La Madera. She interviewed Orlando Gallegos and State Police Captain Martin Vigil. So after witnessing the UFO, the next day Gallegos and his family were headed home to Santa Fe. He heard about Lonnie Zamora's incident and stopped in Espanola to report his sighting to the police officers. The officers interviewed Orlando at length, and they sent State Police Officer Albert Vega to the scene to verify the evidence. After receiving word from Vega that something unusual was at the scene, Kingsbury and Vigil went to the Gallegos home near La Madera, where they found the ground still smoking, 20 hours after the incident had purportedly occurred. Orlando and his family were visiting his father's home, probably because they were going to a wedding shower. And Orlando admitted to having a beer and a shot of whiskey, so this is probably where the feds threw him under the bus as a heavy drinker. It's crazy. Anyway, the family arrived home at 12:30 a.m. and were still up at 1 a.m. when the father heard animals thundering through his yard. Orlando went outside and spotted the object about 200 feet from the house, where he watched it for about 1 minute. When State Police Captain Martin Vigil arrived on the scene, he carefully noted the hot, smoking ground and glass which looked as though it had been melted, and the indentations on the ground. So think about the melted glass evidence. I mean, you have to have a pretty decent fire going to be able to properly melt glass. For example, you would probably want to use hardwoods to get a hot enough fire, but I don't see like any ash or leftover logs or anything like that. So an exploded paint can and just a ground fire probably would not melt glass. Vigil said there were 4 8x12 indentations which were wedge-shaped at the bottom. Very interesting. So the Socorro indentions might be 8x12 and somewhat wedged shape. And this is another perspective of the Socorro indentions, possibly 8x12. And now we get into the alien footprints. There were at least a dozen circular tracks about 3.5 to 4 inches in diameter. So going back to the Socorro landing diagram, we have this general area of footprints. And this is a diagram of those circle or mainly circled prints. You can see the note here where this would make a circle, possible end of print, undetermined due to the type of soil. But you have measurements of 3 inches, 3.5, and 4.5. And unfortunately, this is the only photo I can find of the footprints. but you can still see some of these little round divots. And then remember the description of the footprints of a jar lid being pressed into the sand. But if it wasn't for Lonnie actually seeing the two beings and hearing the hatch door shut, we would never know that those were alien footprints. And then to finish up the interviews for the La Madera landing, Orlando also mentioned that the blue flames which shot out from the object were tinged slightly with orange, and that he only saw 2 of the indentions. And then this piece of information was new. There had been another sighting of a glowing object which buzzed 2 unidentified men in a car near La Madera Sunday morning. This report was made to state police before the Gallegos sighting came to light. So now you can see Orlando Gallegos' UFO sighting in La Madera was actually a twin landing to Lonnie Zamora's Socorro incident. And that is an absolutely huge finding. But instead, all we get is this general layout diagram from Major Bill Connors. Even if La Madera was a hoax, they should have collected the data. And let me show you another Tic-Tac landing. So fast forward 3 years to 1967 in South Hill, Virginia, we have yet another unidentified object. The observer watched a large silver-colored object approximately 12 feet in diameter sitting on the highway. All of a sudden, the object disappeared instantaneously, going straight up. And here we go again. The object departed with a brilliant white column of fire that appeared beneath it and burnt a place on the road. Chemical analysis revealed no unusual chemicals in the burnt area or surrounding area. That sounds familiar to us. And we have local officers immediately on the scene, and they are looking at that burnt area. We have investigators looking at the landing spot, and we have the investigators diagramming the landing marks. So yes, this looks very familiar. Let's take a look at it. Let's start by looking at the local police reports that were sent to the Air Force. The object was approximately 15 feet high, including 4 legs which were estimated to be approximately 3.5 feet tall. The shape of the object was similar to an oval-top water tank. When the object left the ground, the exhaust was a white fire approximately 2 feet in diameter, but no sound was heard. The observer was driving on the road and spotted the object on the ground while he was still in his car. The observer reported that the object went straight up, and he lost sight of it approximately 200 or 300 feet due to the limited vision from his car. The object was visible for only a second or two. This was a night sighting at about 9 p.m., and the observer was leaving work. His name was Mr. Crowder, age 54, and worked at the Mobile Chemical Company. The object left 4 small holes in the street approximately 9.5 feet apart, forming a square. And we have a good diagram, and it shows that it's not a perfect square, and the burn mark is not perfectly in the center either. These holes were approximately 3/4 of an inch in diameter and 1 inch deep in the pavement. This is the best picture I could find of the pavement and the holes that were made in this pavement. So you have your 3/4 inch diameter by about 1 inch deep divot. The object left a burn spot approximately 4 feet long and 2.5 feet wide on the tar and gravel street. The observer said the spot continued to burn for a couple of minutes after the object left the ground. And again, we have a pretty good picture of this burn mark the night that it occurred. So we have Mr. Crowder, who is a manager at the Mobile Chemical Company, leaving the warehouse late at 9 p.m., driving down the road, turning the corner right here, and seeing a UFO. the UFO is sitting in the middle of the street, so he drives a little bit closer and turns on his bright lights. At this point, you get the blast of white light out of the bottom of the UFO and it shoots straight up. Now over here we have a second witness, so what does he have to say? The second witness's name is Mr. Martin, and this is what he wrote. I saw the reflection of the object on a large oak tree nearby. I want to say I did not see the object at all, just a reflection from it on a large oak tree, as I think it was leaving the ground. As you can see, Mr. Martin would be standing here, and about a quarter of a mile away was the large tree where the white flash reflected from. And this is a sketch made by Mr. Crowder of what he saw when looking at the UFO. You can imagine that he was probably looking at it head on or nose first, and we have the legs and where the white flame was emitted. And this case was investigated by the civilian assistants to Project Blue Book. W.T. Powers wrote a really good report that is included in this case. You might remember this name from earlier in the video because he was the one that reverse engineered the Socorro landing site. In his report, Power performs two main tests. The first one was making an impact tester. He built this impact tester to try to recreate the holes in the road surface to see what kind of effort a hoaxer would have to go through. The impact tester holes had sharp edges and stones that had been sheared through. There were no signs of sheared through rocks in the original holes. And I find this very interesting. In the original, there was a rim of tar which had apparently oozed up as the hole was made, so almost as if these pins were heated as they went into the asphalt. And again, the impact tester holes were full of white powder from shattering the rocks, and none of this was seen in the original holes. So then Powers concludes here that nevertheless, the indications are that a rather heavy weight settled slowly onto the objects, or pins, which made the marks, rather than a light weight, such as the end of a pickaxe, making a high velocity impact on the road. So the physical evidence of those pinholes made in the road points toward a UFO. And then the second test involved attempts to reproduce the burn mark. They burned kerosene and gasoline on the road. Power says there were, in other words, noticeable differences between the original patch and the results of the burn tests. It is possible to interpret the original patch as being the result of a high-temperature blast directed downward, playing over the surface of the road for a short time. And as mentioned before, they also took samples to get tested for chemicals. They wanted to determine the presence of any flammable material. The initiator requested the analysis to determine if a flammable liquid could have been applied to the road surface and the liquid ignited. And the result was that the spectrum of the extract from the burnt area was qualitatively identical to the extract of the reference sample. So again, this suggests that the technology used is electrical vertical takeoff and landing. And when we look at the landing sites, it's like they have landing gear that can adapt to the terrain they're landing in. In Socorro, the unevenness was balanced out by this odd placement of the feet. In South Hill, they basically use the asphalt as a landing pad, and we get pretty much a square. In the sandy desert, the feet were wedged shaped to increase the surface area so it doesn't slip. On the asphalt, they just pegged the feet down. It's actually really smart engineering. I mean, this stuff is just crazy to think these aliens are just flying around wherever they want to. But anyway, let's finish up by talking a little bit more about the symbol on the Lonnie Zamora Tic-Tac. Captain Holder created this symbol so it would be easier to determine future fake reports. This symbol is thought to be the real symbol that was on the side of the craft. And this symbol is backed up by some documentation that's in Project Blue Book. It is possible that Chavez and Zamora spoke to people about the genuine symbol prior to the meeting with Captain Holder and the creation of the decoy symbol. And there are some variations of that genuine symbol. So it's not 100% certain what it looks like exactly, but it's generally an inverted V with lines above, below, and through it. Let's hear what Lonnie has to say about the symbol.
When I went up closer to it, I did see the markings.
And someone said that the markings, as you saw it, was an upside-down V with 3 lines running through it.
No, sir, I couldn't tell you that because they still don't want me to say nothing about the markings.
They don't want you to say anything about the markings. All right, we won't question you on that.
Interestingly enough, the decoy symbol has caught some bad debunking theories. For example, the claim that Lonnie mixed up the decoy symbol with the Hughes aircraft or Hughes connecting devices symbol. So the question would be, out of all these genuine variations, where does it lead? I mean, they're basically advertising themselves. Who are they? The short answer is, I don't know. But these triad or trilateral symbols did lead me to Dulce, New Mexico.
Jerry Julian says she had her first extraterrestrial encounter right here on her Dulce ranch about 40 years ago.
They threw down a ladder from that spaceship, and then 2 small people started climbing down.
Many of her neighbors claim similar strange sightings.
Fat in the middle and kind of like rounded on the sides. You're speechless, you know?
But then it starts to get real weird.
They also claim they've seen some creatures cooked up in those experiments, like Bigfoot and something half-human.
Down this way, the waist down, it's a goat. It has a tail. But up here, it's a man.
Jeez, I tell you, for people who've studied ufology, the Dulce area with the Archuleta Mesa and statements like that, it's no big deal. But linking that symbol to this area is very speculative. I don't have any proof of that, and we're not going to go down that path in this video. Let's hear from Lonnie again.
I still think it's something not from here. If I could find out what it actually was, okay, I'm satisfied. I just didn't want to go through it again, you know. If they want to believe me, good. If they don't want to believe me, it's all right too.
Unfortunately, Lonnie ended up quitting the police force not too long after this incident. He did say that if he was to see this craft again, he would run away and never tell anyone what happened. Thanks for watching.